Hello to everybody who's watching this. My name is Alex. I am a basketball fan, and today, in this video, I'd like to tell you about one of the darkest days in NBA history, the Minnesota Timberwolves Joe Smith scandal. Let me start by saying I've been a fan of the Timberwolves since I was a kid. I grew up wanting to play basketball because of players like Isaiah Ryder, Stephon Marbury, Sam Cassell, and particularly Kevin Garnett. The Timberwolves seemed to be growing with me as I grew up. As I went off from elementary school to junior high, the Wolves went from being a losing expansion NBA team to making appearances in the NBA playoffs and giving the best teams of the late 1990s era a real run for their money. They played the Michael Jordan Bulls tough and had competitive playoff series against the Houston Rockets and Seattle Supersonics. I felt like I might see the young Wolves become a championship contender as I was reaching high school. Kevin Garnett, the most fearsome stick bug to ever lace up a pair of Nike shoes, was a lanky, 7-foot-tall human being whose internal competitiveness fueled his teammates and the Wolves fan base. But he was often the lone man who would stand up to high-stakes pressure, as the players around him on the Wolves simply were not of the caliber that could help the clearly superstar talented Garnett advance past the first round of the playoffs. The Wolves franchise decision-makers, owner Glenn Taylor and vice president of basketball operations Kevin McHale, knew that if they were going to justify keeping Garnett on their roster at the very high price that they'd paid for him, Garnett had signed the largest contract in NBA history in 1997, they would have to bring in premium talent to back up their fiery marquee player when the chips were down. At the end of the 97-98 NBA season, the collective bargaining agreement between the NBA's franchise owners and the NBA Players Association expired. Negotiations stalled, leaving the players locked out and free agent players unable to negotiate new contracts with teams. Once the lockout ended in late 1998, the Wolves quickly found out how this impacted their roster. Forward Tom Gugliotta, 1997 NBA All-Star for the Wolves, departed Minnesota for the desert of Arizona, signing with the Phoenix Suns. The Wolves had to replace a key player on their front court and find that replacement quickly, because the end of the lockout left very little time to sort out their roster before meaningful games would be played. They negotiated a deal with former Golden State Warrior and Philadelphia 76ers forward Joe Smith. This is where everything went wrong for the Wolves. Smith, at this point a more than serviceable athlete who had been drafted first overall in the 1995 NBA draft, in fact ahead of Kevin Garnett, was available because he had not wanted to play for the Warriors any longer, so they traded him to the 76ers before the 1998 trade deadline. Smith had been offered a contract extension prior to the 1997-98 season by the Warriors worth more than $80 million. For some reason, Smith turned it down and aimed at free agency. When Smith signed with the Wolves, his contract terms were quite strange. 1 year, salaried at $1.75 million. This did raise some eyebrows, as the Warriors had established his market value to be multiple years and more than 40 times that total salary. After a short time, this oddity was chalked up by sports commentators and Wolves fans as a passion to play good basketball alongside a big star like Garnett, who had begun appearing in high-profile ad campaigns for Nike and Sprite. After the 1998 season ended, Smith signed another one-year contract, this time for $2.1 million. Still strange, though not as much in this instance, as Smith had somewhat underperformed in his first year with Minnesota. The 1999-2000 NBA season played out, and the offseason began. Early on, Smith signed another one-year contract with Minnesota, this time for $2.5 million. One thing that needs to be mentioned here is that players rarely represent themselves in contract negotiations and most commonly hire sports agents to represent them when working with teams to come to terms on the various deals that need to be signed. Smith's agent at the time was Los Angeles-based Eric Fleischer. Unfortunately, Fleischer and a former employee, Andrew Miller, had a very acrimonious falling out that stemmed from Miller leaving Fleischer's agency firm and taking several high-profile clients with him, including Garnett and Smith. Fleischer, who had been personally involved in the negotiating with the Wolves' contracts for Smith, decided to sue Miller for damages. For those who have never been involved in such a process, a legal proceeding of this kind requires all evidence pertaining or potentially pertaining to the suit to be shared with both plaintiff and defendant. This process of sharing documents and records back and forth is known as discovery. In suing Miller, Fleischer was forced to expose records of all contract negotiations between his agency and various NBA franchises. Because of the suit being made public record, the nature of Fleischer's dealings with the Minnesota Timberwolves organization regarding Joe Smith were revealed. What came to light was shocking. Smith had agreed to sign with the Wolves for less than his market value on 3 individual one-year contracts consecutively. On the surface, this may not seem so bad, but it meant that the Wolves had circumvented some very important rules in the collective bargaining agreement between the NBAPA and the league's owners. First, by signing a coveted talent for less than he could have earned by signing elsewhere, the Wolves undercut the ability of other franchises to negotiate with Smith and Fleischer in good faith by making any other team's attempts to lure Smith to their team a secretly moot point. Secondly, had something drastic happened to Smith's health during this period, the Wolves would not have been responsible for paying an injured player in the same way that other teams would. Third, by agreeing to sign consecutive one-year deals rather than a single 3-year contract, the Wolves would not have to pay Smith as much due to salary scaling for veteran players. Most importantly, to why this was a violation of collective bargaining rules was that if Smith had played 3 consecutive seasons with the Wolves would have retained his bird rights. Bird rights is the term for the ability of a team to retain a player who has become a significant part of the team's roster over significant time by paying them a larger sum of money than they would normally or should normally be able to under the rules of the NBA's salary cap. The reason they're called bird rights is that in 1983, the Boston Celtics were concerned that they would be unable to retain future all-time great Larry Bird due to not being able to offer him proper money commensurate with his talent level. The NBA negotiated the bird rights with the NBAPA, meaning that the hard salary cap. Each team may spend a certain maximum amount of money on player salaries, no exceptions. This hard salary cap became a soft salary cap, meaning that each team has a maximum amount of money to spend, but may exceed that amount of salary for exceptions like those mentioned in bird rights, and this allowed the Celtics to retain Bird at a proper pay rate without violating the salary cap. Effectively, what the Fleischer records exposed was that the Wolves knew that in the present time of 1998, they could not attract a sought-after talent like Joe Smith at market value without promising him that if he stayed with them on the cheap for 3 years, they would sign him to a vastly more expensive contract after the 2000-2001 season. The reported amount of salary for the handshake future contract was as high as $86 million over multiple years and would only be possible if the Wolves could use Smith's bird rights to legally exceed the NBA's salary cap. This was highly unethical and violated the NBA's labor laws by being an unbalanced salary payout on a contract that violated existing contract length limits. At this point, players could sign with a team for up to 6 years, meaning that it was a negotiation for a 9-year, heavily backloaded contract. The punishments came down from then NBA Commissioner David Stern swiftly and heavily. First, the Timberwolves organization was fined $3.5 million. Team owner Glenn Taylor was suspended from all team operations and barred from team facilities by the league immediately until August 31st, 2001. And Vice President of Basketball Operations Kevin McHale was, depending on who you ask, suspended or took a leave of absence from the team immediately, lasting until July 31st, 2001. The Wolves franchise was also stripped of its first-round draft picks from 2001 to 2005. J.A. Adonde of the Los Angeles Times described the Wolves' punishment this way: "It's a death sentence. You can just imagine Stern quoting from Ezekiel 25:17, like Samuel L. Jackson in Pulp Fiction. 'And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger.'" For his part, Joe Smith's $2.5 million contract with the Wolves for the upcoming 2000-2001 season was voided, and his previous experience with the Wolves was voided as well, resetting the clock on his bird rights. Smith was once again an unrestricted free agent and signed a 1-year contract with the Detroit Pistons. Stern also advised the NBAPA to take action against Fleischer, as the Players Association does the licensing for player agents. Players Association handed down a $57,000 fine to Fleischer and suspended him for 6 months for his part in the violations of collective bargaining agreement rules. McHale's handling of his punishment was rather troubling as well. According to Sean Hyken of For the Win, a sports-focused office of USA Today, McHale was quoted as saying, quote, "I haven't read a contract in 4 or 5 years." McHale also went on to say that multiple other franchises had done this type of deal and not gotten caught doing so. Quote, "There are 8 to 10 teams that do this all the time. They're just good at it. We're bad," end quote. McHale's admission of responsibility was effectively mixed with a claim of being ignorant about what was in the contracts and also that he had knowledge of other teams in the NBA violating league rules in similar fashion. These two ideas seem to contradict. Did McHale know what was in the Smith contracts and therefore knew that other teams had done these kinds of negotiations? Or was he unaware of what was in them and became responsible for the violations through irresponsible execution of his job as VP of basketball operations? The Wolves did make the playoffs in 2001 at the end of the subsequent season, but were quickly ousted in 4 games of the first playoff round by the San Antonio Spurs. It was no small surprise that without Smith, the team was unable to match up well with the front court height and strength of the Spurs, who sported future Hall of Fame players Tim Duncan and David Robinson. The Wolves had no way of bringing in new blood in the draft either, as they had no first-round draft pick that summer. This issue plagued the Wolves for several years, though the league did end up reinstating their 2003 and 2005 picks. One of the key ways in which NBA teams are able to replenish their roster without having to constantly pay large salaries to veteran players is by drafting amateur players in the off-season draft. These players may be coming from overseas, out of college, or even out of high school. Rookie contracts are very cheap, and finding a quality player via the draft can be a boon for a cash-conscious team. The Wolves, having their top picks voided in 3 of the 5 next years, were unable to do this and were forced to sign aging and expensive players. The team was not able to bolster their roster properly around Kevin Garnett due to the illegal mistake that they had made in dealing with Fleischer and Smith. Interestingly, Smith rejoined the Wolves in the summer of 2001 on a 6-year, $34 million contract. The Wolves eventually moved Smith along with guard Anthony Peeler to the Milwaukee Bucks via a trade and acquired guard Sam Cassell and forward Irvin Johnson, no, not Magic, in return. Both of these players the Wolves received in the trade played key roles in the 2003-2004 team that won 58 games in the regular season and a division title, then reached the Western Conference Finals, where the Wolves lost to the Los Angeles Lakers in 6 games. To date, this is still the high-water mark for the franchise in wins and playoff success. As a fan of the Wolves, what happened next was painful, though eventually bittersweet. Feeling a lack of support from the Wolves organization regarding the development of their player roster and having suffered some injury problems over recent years, the best Wolf of all time wanted a change of scenery. Kevin Garnett wanted to win a championship and likely would never have won one in Minnesota due to the bungling of the franchise's operations by Taylor and McHale. On the night of the 2007 NBA draft, McHale traded Garnett to the Boston Celtics for 4 players, none of whom ever really made an impact on the franchise. Garnett's 2007-2008 season in Boston ended showered in confetti, having won the NBA championship with the Celtics in his first year with that team. We Wolves fans were happy to see him win, but in the way that a person kind of watches an ex get married. Garnett is the one that got away for Wolves fans. Smith, for his part, ended up playing out a 16-year career in the NBA as a journeyman and never really a star player. He bounced between multiple franchises, playing for 11 of the league's 30 franchises before retiring in 2011. Smith's decision to participate and agree to these illegal dealings with the Timberwolves had a massive impact on his earnings. In total, his career salaried earnings were about $61.2 million, according to Smith's player page on basketballreference.com. This is roughly $25 million less than he could have earned off of a single contract if he had simply signed with a team for 3 years to establish the bird rights without resorting to unethical agreements, and even about $20 million less than Smith was offered to re-sign with Golden State. Kevin McHale was fired by the Wolves organization in 2009, and he retired from basketball activity altogether after a coaching stint with the Houston Rockets ended in 2015. Owner Glenn Taylor has overseen one of the most losing franchises in NBA history, having only made the playoffs twice since the 2004 run to within sniffing distance of the NBA Finals. He will soon turn over the team to new primary ownership led by mogul Mark Lowry and retired baseball legend Alex Rodriguez, and the team looks to have secured some hope in the core of a new young team.